is that, oh, there we go, here's the recording. I have several sort of apertures or contributions that I bring to the industry. One, and probably the most exciting recently, being First 500, that I intend to talk to you guys a lot about tonight. I'm very excited about it, and just want to thank the AIAS for having me tonight.
Thank you. So now we will get into Jacoby's introduction.
Thank you. My name is Jacoby. I'm currently based in the Philadelphia area. I am currently pursuing a master's and doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania in history and theory, and history and theory of architecture, that is. And I just graduated in 2020, so never had a full graduation from Drexel, where I received my BArch. And I study Black space making practices, which I'll talk a little bit on how I landed there instead of a traditional architecture firm path that we're often told to pursue. And I would love to just hear what you all think of that, and then also hearing from our other lovely panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Jacoby. And finally, we have Jonathan Moody.
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I'm a little bit of a back forth and start in the middle, back and forth and back in the middle. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My father started a firm that I work for now. I went away to school up in upstate New York at Cornell, and then I went out to UCLA for grad school, and then moved back to Columbus about 11 years ago. And 2 years ago, I became CEO. We're the largest Black-owned firm in the country, and we had the amazing honor and blessing of being named the 2021 AIA Firm Award winner. So excited to be here and learn and discuss more.
Awesome. Thank you so much for these introductions. We will now get right into the presentations. We're starting with Tiara, if you don't mind sharing your screen.
Yes, let's see. Did that work?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm just pulling up. All right, so again, thank you so much for having me. I'm extremely excited to be here and tell you guys a little bit about First 500. And for those of you who are not familiar, it's been around for a little bit. I'll do a quick kind of run through of the timeline of First 500, including its inception, and then transition into telling you a little bit about us, our mission, and then the online presence that we've developed, a little bit about our structure, and then of course, a look ahead. So starting with the timeline, First 500 was actually founded in 2018 as a national kind of research endeavor. And this was born out of me kind of learning the horrific statistics that Black women occupy within the industry. You know, right now, Black women architects make up less than 1% of all licensed architects. And so I said, I needed to learn a little bit more about this. And upon that, I created First 500. I traveled all around the country to speak to these different entities and groups like yours to raise awareness about this. And then kind of marching forward, continuing to raise awareness. We also created the actual LLC in 2019. And then 2020, we are all familiar with the events that took place. But George Floyd was murdered, and it was really a wake-up call for our industry to self-reflect, and for First 500 to do some deep thinking about not only what's happening in our own country, but across the world, right, with racial injustices, and how First 500 could position itself to become global. So we became global. And then of course, last year, just in October, we actually launched our online social media presence, which was 1 year to the date of when we reached 500 Black women architects living in the US. And so a little bit about our mission. We are obviously centered around all about Black women architects and Black women in architecture, creating this central community to raise awareness about their distinction while also inspiring young Black girls and women to enter architecture and continue their journeys into licensure. And so I mentioned already about raising awareness at its inception. We've since then developed 2 additional pillars for what First 500 stands for and what's all embodied. The second being resourcing her roadmap. And so if you look on our website under the resources tab, I'll talk a bit more about that. There's a list of resources available tailored to Black women in architecture and making sure that she feels that she belongs and that she knows those resources are for her. And it's chronological, so super easy to follow. And then also a list of books that are either Black authored or mention Black architects within them. And of course, Moody Nolan's publications are listed within that list. And then of course, building a central community, right? So within the profiles, there's links to a lot of these women's work, their websites, whether it's personal or their jobs, and then also their social media handles, so you can connect with them. And then of course, we all know with the pandemic that the web has become like so important to us and connecting us all. And so we have put a lot of time into developing our online presence. This is what the website looks like now, first500.org. I highly encourage you all to check it out. Our social medias are also, continuously updated with lots of amazing graphics that you can see that really just keeps Black women at the forefront and helps educate us on, again, the statistics and what we all can be doing to change this and move this forward. And then our media presence has also included lots of partners. This is a short list and it has since extended of media kind of partners that we've been able to, get our voices out there and stories heard. And obviously they had an interest in First 500 and kind of spreading awareness about Black women in architecture. And then I mentioned the leadership for our group was kind of, oh my gosh, and I'm sure Jonathan personally knows a lot of women on here, 3 of which come straight out of Moody Nolan's leadership to help guide and serve as the brain trust for First 500. And so the 7 that you see at the top are the board members, and the 4 FAIA members at the bottom are our advisors. And kind of, again, we are all kind of steering the ship together to make sure if we have a platform, a global platform dedicated to Black women, we want to make sure that its leadership is centered around Black women as well. And we all see them represented. And I'm kind of the silent seat that's not mentioned here. And so looking ahead, some of the things that we've started that we definitely want to do more of is these interviews. We started interviewing Black women architects. Our second Black woman architect and 3rd episode is tomorrow night. So I highly encourage you guys to tune in to our Instagram live to check out that video and that interview with Danny out of SOM. It's going to be phenomenal, guys. And then of course, highlighting our students has been something that has taken off really well. And again, getting visibility to the Black women who are really at the beginning of their architecture journeys, but again, have the support of this platform there every step of the way for them. And then last but certainly not least, if I could leave you guys with anything, I would say definitely follow our handles. We are on everything. Again, I showed you some of those amazing graphics earlier. Follow to stay up to date. I would say check out our resources as well on our website, and then spread the word about First 500. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiara. That's truly inspiring, just seeing how much the platform has grown over time and seeing the future ambitions it has. So congrats to you and the rest of the team leading this. Again, it's truly inspiring. We will get into our second presentation of the night. So Jacoby, if you don't mind sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Can everyone see this okay?
Looks great.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so just some background about me. Again, my name is Jacoby Smith. I use she, her pronouns. And I just graduated from Drexel University with a BArch in 2020 and jumped right into architecture, history, and theory research at University of Pennsylvania, which is literally just across the street, if anyone's familiar with Philadelphia. I focus primarily on Black space making and how to use architecture as a tool for resistance. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit about that. I apologize if it's like really fast or some areas are very vague. We probably don't have, enough time for me to talk about aspirations from my dissertation, so I'll keep it pretty quick. So for me, although I'm currently based in Philadelphia, as I was saying with some people who are here earlier, I'm originally from Orlando, Florida, which is where I first encountered architecture. Most of us think of architecture as like homes or office buildings or schools. I was introduced to architecture as theme parks. So I was used to going to Disney World or Universal Studios. So for me, architecture was about immersive landscapes. One of my favorite parks, Islands of Adventure at Universal, is actually where I decided that I wanted to be a designer. It hit me while staring at some beautiful rock work and a restaurant and also a roller coaster. I thought, geez, well, someone gets paid to design this. Like someone gets paid to design fun for a living. And that for me blew my mind. From then on there, I was like, I want to do anything I can, whether it's architecture or specifically with arts or with engineering. I want to get into this, right? I want to design these immersive landscapes. So for me, architecture is very theatrical. It's about getting out of one world into this other world of performance, where it's not just the physical materiality of architecture or the buildings, but it's what you can see and what you can't see. It's the sounds, it's the smells of, ice cream or vanilla waffle wafers on Main Street, USA at Disney. So those were things that were really interesting to me because it's the interaction with buildings, the space making, that makes architecture seem alive to me. And so I call this, area of my life, this first interaction of architecture, as architecture for curating. And it wasn't until I migrated 1,000 miles away from home to Philadelphia that it occurred to me that although there's this beautiful tool, architecture, that can be used to expose people to different worlds and different ways of thinking and living and interacting, that architecture can also be a very dangerous tool. And it could be a tool for othering. When I came to my architecture college career, I realized that there weren't too many people who looked like me. There weren't too many people who looked like me who were teaching, and there weren't a lot of people who looked like me in the curriculum. The places that we study, for all of you who are on here who are currently in architecture school, you can probably name a few architects of the canon right off the top of your head. And none of them are probably Black or even people of color in general. And that was something that really struck me. It was something that I had to come face to face with, that this tool that I thought was so amazing was actually being used for the ghettoization of Black and brown people, right? Philadelphia has one of the highest population of Black people in any US city. And here it is that I'm studying architecture to design theme parks, and I'm coming to confront, my own privileges when I enter these spaces. Learning about redlining was very jarring to me, and the fact that these things weren't being taught openly in the curriculum was something that really kind of terrified me. So throughout my BArch journey, I don't think I would have even made it if it wasn't for some of the supportive leadership that I had at my university to kind of help me find out or even start to question some of these things and be open to hearing me talk about those. So I went from architecture as curating to architecture as a tool for othering that makes people like me or Latinx or Asian or queer or people with disabilities seem kind of invisible. So I really wanted to start to question that in my own practices. And I started to shift away from architecture practice into architecture history and theory. I started to ask, how is this tool being used historically, right, by Black people? Where are their histories in the archive? Why aren't we talking about them, right? Like, what's so great about the canon that we can't insert these Black narratives into? My own PhD journey was a bit of a shock. Everyone in my family and also at school was shocked that I was applying to a doctoral program. I went through 6 years of architecture school at Drexel. If you asked me at any point throughout that time, I would have told you I've done my time, I'm done. but for me, there was just this thing that I couldn't get rid of the question of, why aren't we in the curriculum? Where is our history, right? We talk about architecture history and a global architecture history, but where's my history in that? Was something that I started to question. So I joined University of Pennsylvania in fall 2020, and my master's research that I just submitted, actually, which is really great, is about Black Panther Party. And we talk a lot about the Black Panther Party as kind of been demonized and weaponized, and histories of race and struggle of Black liberation, but we haven't looked at their studies on architecture as a tool and their space making practices and these communities that they've actually created. And in my case that I studied, the libraries that they actually created in Philadelphia. So a lot of my research has to do with mining the archives, looking at things outside of just the building, leaning on other people's interviews or photographs or newspapers to kind of find those and piece together some narratives. And although this exists on, this is kind of a big scale thing, this exists on smaller scales as well, using architecture as a tool of liberation or transforming space. For example, Philadelphia neighborhoods, what's often called, the projects, right? Or the ghetto. We're often thinking of them as very dangerous places. But if you actually see how people use these spaces, Philadelphia's stoop culture is very prominent for anyone familiar with that, which it may be similar things elsewhere, like in New York, where people are sitting outside on the stoop. Older citizens are sitting outside on the stoop to make sure that the children can play safely on the street, right? Or places where there may be street performers in the middle of Center City, Philadelphia. You're not going to walk or move through that space the same way if they weren't there. They transform the space. So looking at just basic things that we do on a living basis, on a daily living basis, that actually transform how we think about architecture, and how can we use that as a tool of liberation and validate that as an architectural tool, which strips away kind of this formalism way that we think about architecture, that it has to be building. I look at architecture as what are our practices that we're doing, that we're transforming or thinking of space differently, and what are we doing? And I would ask us all, as whether educators or if we're advocating for, in Tiara's case, Black women, or if we're architecture students, what are some of the tools that you have to push forward liberation? And not just liberation for Black people, but liberation for all marginalized people. What are we doing? And internally, I always question, how can my research honor this resistance? And I would just like us to continue reflecting on this. And I know this was very, very quick, and I can expand on some of these points later in a Q&A, but I would like for us to think about what ways we can bring visibility through our own work to some of these Black narratives or other narratives that have been systematically silenced. And what narratives is your architecture resisting? Is it resisting, this canon? Is it resisting racism? I would just really love to have that conversation and extend that conversation, not just as an architecture historian in a making, but as an architect and as someone who would love to teach architectural designers what things can we do in studio and beyond to kind of bring light to some of these issues. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Jacoby. That was really thoughtful. You left us with a lot with your research, a lot to think about and really reflect on. So props to you for pursuing that path within architecture, which is really important. Our next presenter is going to be Jonathan. So if you don't mind sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Yep, and it's gonna mess up. I already know that, just because that's the way it works. Yep, on cue, it's showing the wrong screen. There we go. All right. So, wow, I'm kind of anxious just to get into the panel discussion now. Coming after Tiara and Jacoby, because the discussion about I think about First 500, and it's not like you're talking about an organization that was founded 50 years ago. You said 2018 in terms of its mission, and in terms of thinking about current architectural discourse and the opportunity. It was interesting because it transitions well. A quote from my dad is that can architecture be a platform? And we've been having a lot of discussion, thought process about that in the last year, given the honor that is the firm award recognition, and how can we leverage that platform to draw attention in so many areas. So for me personally, my journey was, I didn't realize it was unique, but it's become a platform to talk further about some of the challenges in and around our industry. I grew up, my dad's an architect, and I didn't realize how rare that was until later in life. And a big part of the start of our firm is doing work in Black communities. Our first project was over on the far right. It's a New Life Apostolic Church here in Columbus, Ohio. And it was, hey, in our communities, there weren't many people who, let alone someone who knew an architect, let alone a Black architect, but says, hey, if we can hire to do a church, and then slowly those churches grew into, say, libraries, or the famous family life centers or rec centers, community centers, schools, and we really just kept kind of building on projects where we had opportunities where someone gave us a chance and pushed beyond it. And then so much so that my dad, I still remember in 1992, going to, first time I'd been to the AIA conference, I thought it was a family vacation, but when he was honored with the Whitney Young Award, and I didn't know much, but that's my drawing on the right saying, hey, my dad got an award for being an architect. And I thought it was something, everybody gets awards for doing things. And I didn't realize until I got older how unique the firm was, and the fortune that we had from so many different people over the years in terms of advancing our practice. One of the original buildings was an old building that we'd renovated and turned into our office on the left, and to a building we built new in the top right, and some of the opportunities we have along the way. And we really just built a practice of being of service in the communities that we were, and we just basically never let go of any building type. We just kept doing them and learning from them and combining ideas, and it turned into not just a diversity of the types of people who worked on projects, but also in the project types that we worked on that really complemented one another. And we started expanding it around the country to other cities and markets where we found similar challenges around communities that were often overlooked. So these statistics are old, but I'll they're from 2015, but I think it's still a very telling thing. I actually just added these at the last minute because I realized students would probably appreciate it, or just, I think it's just a good awareness of, this is the current date, well, 2015 data on the makeup of the racial makeup of architecture schools based on, gender and race. And this is what the professions look like in 2015. It has improved a bit, but it does not look like what you're seeing in school. And we started putting this together because we didn't quite realize that our firm looked a lot different than some of our peer firms. And actually, even since this, our current diversity of our staff is about 43%, which we didn't realize was a unique thing. And it really was just a story of in a lot of these historically overlooked communities, can architecture be a tool or a platform, or a differentiator, or something that, as you say, is a tool of resistance, or kind of opportunity. So we found just over the years that, if we hired people who really understood those communities, that we could do better work, we could do transformative work in a lot of those communities that have not had those opportunities. And we're in a time now, it's a very, I think, exciting time, I'll say, in that we know that there's so much work that can and needs to be done in these overlooked communities. And what better time to be in position to be of service to help where we can, as much as we can. So say here in Columbus, there's, the Linden neighborhood, it's one of those, it's an older neighborhood, but it's just so much flight out of the neighborhood. And now it's one of these neighborhoods that, people are looking back to say, hey, how can it be redeveloped? But we're looking at opportunities where this project's complete now, of saying, hey, can we take old parks or overlooked space and create those community hubs or community spaces? And what are the different types of things that would be needed in those types of buildings to bring people together? So it ends up becoming, a rec center, a place where people work out, but also, demonstration kitchens and community gardens and music studios and healthcare spaces, that kind of, all of those things that were different aspects of our practice kind of have to become all in one in these types of community centers and community spaces. Even in like in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the idea of student wellness and what does that mean, and what does it mean particularly in a challenge around, Columbus is very flat, Pittsburgh is not. And, could you do the ideas, we typically do our rec centers that are 2 or 3 story buildings at the most. What they said, what we need in order to maximize our program, can we do it in a 9, 10, or 11 story building built into a hillside? So this is a project that I think we're actually finishing construction documents on here pretty soon. And hopefully it'll be open in somewhere in the 18 to 24 month range in Pittsburgh. And one that's pretty special for me, this conversation of, can you be of service? Can you really understand the communities that you come from? And so I remember one of the first stories of my preschool going to visit a library. All I knew to say was that my dad drew the library. Moody Nolan did the original Carl Road branch in the 80s, and we were hired to come back and do a replacement branch. And to think about the opportunity to bridge between generations, to say that my father had done the original branch, I worked on this one, but the truth is this building is in the community I grew up in, and it's for the next generation of people. And this was a recent photography in the snow that I really love snow shots, but that's a personal bias. And in that same Linden neighborhood, using our practice as a tool to have more conversation. If we reevaluated, our firm's giving, instead of things like golf outings or fundraisers, that what if we put much of our resources as we could in just building one home? It wasn't that we could solve all of the challenges around housing, but maybe we could raise the level of conversation, and it would make a world of difference for one family to be able to fund and build and give away a house for one family in the same Linden neighborhood. So that project is complete. and we're keeping the address anonymous. And we've started construction on the second house in Nashville. Hopefully in a few months, it'll be more underway. And then might be looking at Chicago soon, but that's another story. But our commitment and our goal is just to continue to use the project as a tool to talk about what is really a national housing crisis in overlooked communities in each of our 12 offices around the country. So that's my spiel. And in a year of where we couldn't submit a company photo, this was our cover where we literally photoshopped everybody's face into our cover for the firm award submission. So with that, I'll stop sharing and
thank you so much, Jonathan.
Yep.
It's again another inspiring presentation, just hearing how you're building onto your father's legacy and doing really important work on these underserved communities. So again, thank you for your presentation. So with that, wrapping up, we will now get into our Q&A portion. I will kick it off with the first question of the night. Are there any particular demands that come to mind when thinking of making the architecture industry more equitable, more specifically directed at NAB and NCARB? And we don't have to go in any particular order, just whoever wants to jump on the question first can go.
Well, I can jump in. Victor, I think you are starting us off hot because I have a lot to say about this one. You know, NAB determines which schools become accredited, right? And so, you know, my question is, have they thought about the pipeline for increasing the number of accredited HBCUs? Considering about a third of our Black students, our Black architecture students, graduate with degrees from these institutions. You know, this is a big issue for me because of 100 plus HBCUs, only 7 of them are accredited, right? And have the architecture education, and which that statistic is similar to the how they stand up to all accredited architecture schools. You know, there's about 130 plus or minus accredited architecture universities. And again, 7 of them are HBCUs, that's about 5%. And yet about a third of our Black students are getting their education from these institutions that are becoming architects for the built environment. And so we need, this is a call to action for NAB to pour more resources into these existing HBCUs, the 7, and to create a pipeline to maybe increase the number from 7 that we've had for quite a while now to include more HBCUs, since we understand that majority of our Black graduates are coming out of HBCUs. I'll pause there and let my other colleagues talk before I get on NCARB.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll tag onto it too, and I'll kind of add in a criticism that someone aimed at me that I felt personally, and it's really around the idea of pathways, and I think the recognition and acknowledgement that the profession, if it's trying to broaden, right, gives more access to more people. The idea, to Tiara's point, that say, hey, there's only these schools, there's only this way that you can do it. Why is there such a limitation? And you have to begin to expand those, if the boundaries of what the mold is, if you want more access. I think the criticism that somebody put on me that I felt that was like, it's true, but it is pushing towards NAB and NCARB. I live in Columbus, Ohio. The largest school down the street is Ohio State. It's a 4-year undergraduate program. Many of you, I'm sure, like many people around the country, attend 4-year undergraduate programs. As an employer, we hire many Ohio State grads with the full understanding that, hey, you're probably just going to work for us for a few years and then go off and apply to grad school. And we're saying, oh man, we'd be more than happy just to get you for a few years, you know, plant into you, sow into you, you go to grad school, and hopefully you come back. So the criticism that somebody put at me is, why is that same option not available for community college students? Like, why do we not offer those same opportunities to say, hey, as an employer, you know, if somebody goes for an associate's degree program for whatever their life circumstances may be, why don't we say, hey, let me work, why don't you work for me? Why don't we tailor some positions specifically for them to say, hey, you can come work for us, save up some money, because, you know, many people have, you know, challenging circumstances. They may need to put on pause for a few years. There may be a pandemic that says, hey, I want to do other things, but why are there not more pathways? And that's kind of flipping it back to say, even if we did that, there's no clear path that says, hey, if I start off in a non-traditional education route, there's not really clarity on how you get into the profession. And I would say, you know, why is there, if there's a 4 and 2, why is there not a 2 and a 4 program? And I'm like, I don't have a good answer, but that's not necessarily, that's more on NAB and NCARB to help answer that. I do know that those conversations are happening as well.
I think as far as for me as an aspiring architectural historian, I'm more of you know, I hear the criticism from not only myself, but other students around me, whether pursuing their BArch or BS in architecture or their MArch, or even doctoral students. We're all asking, you know, why are we not pluralizing the canon, or where are Black and other marginalized communities when it comes to architecture history? And you have to dive deep into the NAB requirements to find the answers. You know, everyone's has a set list of requirements to hit, amount of credit hours to hit, and NAB and other, you know, people as well who are affiliated, I'm sure, are setting those requirements of what they think is important, right? They're the ones saying, no, you have to learn about Le Corbusier, you have to know Frank Lloyd Wright, you have to know, you know, these 3 things, you have to learn about Rome, you have to learn about Greece. Like, those are the things that are always hit, and they're mostly Eurocentric, right? Even the architecture that you do learn, if you learn about Monticello at UVA, you're not learning that the slaves actually built it, right? Like, if we're learning about, you know, even architecture history, like, you're not really learning who's the actual builder in these places, and to whose benefit and to whose deficit are we talking about these things, and expanding on it. And it takes a lot of honesty, and I've been finding that there are professors doing the work to kind of critique the canon, but they're still having to teach the canon because that's what the NAB requirement is. And I've had these conversations in and out of classrooms, and we always kind of circle around to NAB. You know, it always goes back to, well, this is the requirement, and we don't have room in the schedule to do anything beyond this requirement. And if you do, then you have to take an elective, right? Like, if I want to learn about, you know, Black architecture, then I need to really take a class on like Africana studies or art history, and then spin it to talk about architecture, right? There's always this extra thing. So I think the call to action is for NAB to, I guess, put their money where their mouth is, as far as, you know, we talk about diversity and inclusion, but there seems to be a lack of doing the work to actually do that in a classroom. And it's not enough to, you know, bring more Black people in if we're still not talking about Black people, right? Like, it's not enough to, you know, bring these marginalized communities in and not provide support and show them what it looks like to be a Black architect, or, and it's not just one singular aspect, right? Like, Black culture isn't a singular thing. There's different ways of experiencing Blackness, and people need those options so that they can choose or experiment or forge their own path to becoming a Black architect. And that's not possible with the requirements that we have now for NAB. And it's making it extremely difficult for professors to talk about non-European architecture when you always have to bring up the Le Corbs and the Frank Lloyd Wrights of the world. So that's my kind of critique of the NAB requirements on who is it who's actually saying that these things are important. Because if the students don't think it's important, or the employers don't think it's important, why are we teaching it?
Can I transition us to your second half of your question, Victor? Jacoby and Jonathan, I agree 1000% with everything that you're saying. I do have a gripe with NCARB as well. I think I've been in a lot of these think tank conversations with, us leaders around the table saying kind of, what can we do? What can we do? And kind of banging our heads against the wall. And in several of these discussions with leaders, but also with just colleagues and everyday people who, everyday Black women who are struggling to cross the licensure kind of, finish line, prices are an issue. We graduate with a lot of debt, and our income is pretty low compared to some of our adjacent professionals that spend equal, if not less than us on their education, right? And so for a group, and I'm specifically focusing on Black right now, with Black History Month being the last day, but NCARB recently released their pass rates with a racial breakdown, right, of who is passing, what percentages, and there was a huge disparity on every single test of Black folks having very, very low pass rates. And because of that, and also lack of taking tests, right? Because of that, I am suggesting, and this is my call to action to NCARB, to waive the test fees of Black test takers. And it is not going to equate to higher pass rates, but what it will equate to is more people, more Blacks testing, right? Which would ultimately mean more passes and more licensed Black architects. And for me, it's a drop in a bucket, right? Because Black people make up 2.5% of all licensed architects. We make up such a small percentage of the population that I don't think it's going to break the bank, for them to waive those fees, right? Waive the test fees, create more resources, specifically to Black test takers. This is what we mean when we say equity as opposed to equality, where you respond to me. Full disclosure, guys, about a year ago, I did a call to action online, and I basically said the same thing to NCARB. I called them out and said, hey, waive the fees. And it went viral, right? Thousands and thousands of retweets and yada, 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 and everyone calling out NCARB. And NCARB's response was, oh, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. We're actually going to publish a new practice test for each of the exams so that everyone will have more access to tools, and it'll be free. And I said, that is not equitable. That is not even responding to this call of action that we've called you out for. And so that's a small, kind of piece of a lot of things that I feel like is wrong right now. But I think doing that will have the most impact for the least amount to NCARB's pockets.
Thank you all so much. That was absolutely insightful, and I'm so blown away by these responses. Thank you. So of course the NAV and NCARB are a hot topic, but we're also wondering, when thinking of post-secondary architectural education, what do you think individual universities and colleges can do better in supporting Black architecture students? And then this is also a question of maybe what can the AIAS do better and improve their support of Black students? And whoever wants to start.
I'll try and jump in. And so one thing that I do think a lot about, and we're actually having, it's funny, Tiara, because I was seeing Lisa and I have, been talking a lot about this topic in terms of support. And so there's a group of Cornell alum who are getting together, because I still remember vividly, what made such a huge difference for me when, coming from Columbus, Ohio to Ithaca, New York, like this is in the middle of nowhere. I have no idea what's going on. And there were two things that stick out in my mind vividly. One of which is, first of all, they had diversity hosting weekend, which is Cornell as a university said, hey, we want to work hard to recruit these students, and we're going to have a whole weekend devoted to diversity hosting, which hindsight was a little bit like, I'm saying misleading, but out of love, but meaning like you get to campus and you're like, oh my gosh, look at all these diverse people. This is amazing. This must be what campus is like every weekend. But they paid for me to come out and visit the school, say, hey, you've been accepted. You should really strongly consider this. And the first person who greeted me at the airport is the late Leon Lawrence, and I'll never forget him. His position is Director of Multicultural Affairs. And more than anything, his job was to say, hey, Jonathan, what is it you need? How can I support you? I want to see you be successful. Can I get you involved with this program? Can I get you involved with that program? And even beyond that, for anybody who knew Leon, because unfortunately he passed away, it was he was even beyond that. It was like, hey, Jonathan, have you ever seen a Broadway show? And I'm like, I'm from Ohio. Why would I have seen a Broadway show? I'm going to take you over on a weekend. We're going to go see a Broadway show. I mean, it was so much deeper than that, but it was in hindsight. And this is a part of, I can't say anything beyond of my own personal success, but for the people who sacrificed and helped and say their job was to say, their job is to be sure I'm successful. So what is happening a lot now is there's a lot of conversations for undergraduate and graduate institutions about support. And it's like literally for support meant for me is a funded and available person whose job it is to ensure students have support they need and ask questions beyond just, hey, what organizations, what things, like literally it's somebody's job to ensure the students are successful. And specifically, even call it something vague like Cornell did, multicultural affairs, to say, hey, he's gonna cater to a certain group of students to ensure their success. So I think that is one of the things, if a lot of schools and universities are serious about supporting students, it needs to be somebody's job to be sure the students are supported.
I would just add on to that. I think it's really important to hire Black people. And I know that sounds really like elementary, but it's very difficult. My program was a 2+4. So I was a full-time student for 2 years and then was a part-time student for 4 while working full-time. It was very difficult to navigate architecture practice and also architecture education without knowing any Black architects. It was very hard. There were things that frustrated me that, my white professors sometimes just couldn't understand. And it wasn't that they didn't want to understand. It was just a cultural thing that they just couldn't, it just couldn't relate to me on that level. There are a lot of students who, we have Jonathan here, who is the exception, right? Who grew up in a household where there is already an architect there, but there are also, in the case of Philadelphia, a lot of students from the city going into these programs who have no exposure to architecture, and they don't know what it looks like to be an architect, let alone an architect of maybe someone from their neighborhood or someone who went to a similar high school than them, how to navigate those. It's very difficult. So I would say representation in the most basic sense of having Black people near you. And also once they get through the door, being patient and being able to unlearn your own biases as an educator is so important. And I think the way I survived was my program director was my lifeline. I would go in her office and literally just cry and be like, I feel like I don't belong here. No one looks like me. No one thinks thinks about design like me. Like, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know what the goal is here. And having her just listen, even if she didn't have answers, but just listen and validate what I had to say was very important. And not only just as a Black woman, but just as a person experiencing life, right? I think a lot of students, a lot of these things going to school is a cultural shock. And especially on top of that, if you go to a PWI and you're the only one and you feel like you can't leave because no one else is there to represent your culture, it's a lot of weight on people's shoulders. And having someone in a school like Jonathan is saying to just check up on students and make sure that okay, is really important. And also financially supporting these students, because in a lot of programs, you lose funding after a certain amount of years. You don't actually know what scholarships are out there. So being honest with students and letting them know what opportunities are out there for them to seek and when they need to seek it, not sending it out a week before the due date for a scholarship, so that they actually have time to do it with intent and with purpose, so that I can move forward and be successful. I think there's just some basic needs of community listening that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I would say too, and I'm tapping a little bit into my urban design side here, because you guys touched on everything, you know, on my list internally about the institution. But I would say too, the education right now as it stands is very removed from reality, in the sense of kind of handing a student a prompt and a random site and, hey, design this, design a random, you know, the museum, right? Or something that's gonna, in our case, gonna house a tractor. Like, I had no connection before college to a tractor ever. And so it's just like, it was all these paradigms and just misalignments in the education connecting to the students, the Black students, right? Which is true when you get into the industry and start testing. But I would also challenge those institutions to really dig deep and connect to the surrounding communities. The institution that I teach at here, IIT, is the Illinois Institute of Technology. We actually have had two different locations for our studios. One year was with Englewood in Chicago, which is a very well-known, like, historically Black community. And then Lawndale and Garfield, which are also Black communities on the West Side. And those students, our students had never, you know, stepped foot, you know, south of the campus, which is where the Black communities reside, right? And it was just very telling of these schools kind of insulating themselves from the surrounding communities, especially if it's you know, low income or minority communities surrounding the schools. So I would challenge the institutions to be much more, I think you guys are kind of future leaders, right? And also you're in this moment where design is a tool to really explore and put yourselves out there and solve real world issues. And connecting with those surrounding communities could do just that and create these really, really fruitful connections to the school and your curriculum.
So thank you again for your really thoughtful answers, and kind of going on the track again of education, and with organizations such as Design as Protest on the rise, how can we begin to start teaching principles of design justice in architecture school? How do we design justice into spaces that have created conditions of violence and racial inequities, i.e. thinking about spaces like highways or new developments that have harmed existing communities and created conditions for gentrification and Black erasure? Let me know if y'all need me to repeat that. I know it was a lot.
Yeah, so this is right up my alley with research on how do we do this, and how do we do this in a way that it goes out of kind of this history of architecture or history of urban design into studios. And I think that's kind of the gap with a lot of students that I currently teach with now, is that we're not really understanding how to bring that into the studio and what to do with that knowledge. And I think it requires studio instructors to be very honest about the history and the role that architecture has played historically in racial division. Racism is not new, right? You know, Black Lives Matter has been going on for quite some time, but that is not new. Black Lives Matter has been going on for you know, centuries with different names on it. Stop Asian Hate has been going on for centuries with different names on it, right? We could go down the list of every marginalized community, and architecture is in the mix of that. I talked briefly in my presentation about redlining. There's a really great resource that I believe it's called Mapping Inequality. And there's an entire database of redlining maps across the United States of America that was developed, I believe, in the 1930s through the 1950s. And we have to be very honest about that, right? And we can take a map of Philadelphia from 1940s and a map of a Philadelphia now and do some racial overlays, and it's the same, right? It's the same. And the architecture that we're doing there, thank you for sharing that. And we have to understand the history of that in order to confront it and design anything for justice. And I think it requires us being uncomfortable and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think a lot of us are afraid of digging up some racial inequities because we feel like, maybe we're not qualified to talk about it. Maybe it's not our problem. Maybe it's not our community that's directly being affected. But we all have a responsibility as designers who are literally building the future, right? Like, we're literally building the built environment for the next generation. And it's our job to at least address these things. And I think the biggest critique that I get as a person who's involved in social cultural architecture is that, architecture can't solve poverty. Architecture can't solve, people tell me that architecture can't solve housing inequity, but, architecture has been involved in creating it. Architecture has been involved in creating poverty and racial divisions and all these other things. Therefore, we have to be part of the solution, and we have to be willing to be very radical about it and to also be wrong. I think a lot of us in studio, we're so afraid that it has to be perfect that we're not experimental enough. No one's asking for construction documents on your studio project when you're done, right? Like, this is your time to be radical, because when you get into the profession, you may not always have that opportunity, right? And in reality, you're the next generation of practitioners. So it's up to you to be radical and come up with some solutions, right? And it's okay to spend 5 years of your architecture career trying to find an answer and not having any, but now you have a resume or you have a portfolio that shows the documentation. You're building archives on how to figure it out. And that's how I would love to kind of approach and branch I guess, the gap of justice in architecture. I just don't think we're ready to be radical enough. I don't know, maybe that's a little Afro-pessimistic, but.
Yeah, I can jump in and add on to that. Jacoby, you're dropping some gems. I agree, though, with a lot of her sentiments on, justice and equity has to be embedded, in the curriculum and in the way moving forward, right? Like, before, like she mentioned earlier, the Le Corbusiers, Mies van der Rohes of the world, right? Like, if I pulled up a screen of all of their faces or their buildings without the names, you could name those architecture buildings, you could name their faces. But can we say the same for a Norma Clark, right, which was the third licensed Black woman architect in the US, or a Beverly Green, who was the first Black woman licensed architect in the US, right? Can we do the same? I can assure you that every single one of us on this call would not pass. If I quizzed us right now, we wouldn't pass. And that's not a fail to us, it's a fail to our education and the systematic racism that we're discussing now. So justice has to be embedded. And moving forward, that just has to be the way. And I think for the current tenured faculty, I say that with some, with some beef behind it, because, they are tenured faculty means you are essentially protected, as a person that's going to teach the future generations, right? And as a protected person, I think that you should do a self-reflection and understand your strengths and also understand your shortfalls, right? And seek out help where you are unable to fill those gaps, right? So our current professors, our tenured professors, a lot of them are not specialists in justice work and equity and understanding how we deconstruct systematic racism and teach our students to think beyond that and challenge ourselves on our everyday norms, right? Like they are not, that wasn't a part of their architecture education. And so they naturally are not adept at how to bring that into the classroom today for the current students. And so seeking help is okay, and I highly encourage it. And then you mentioned the perfectionist syndrome that we all suffer from as architects. I think we absolutely have to get over that. You know, some of my most proudest projects right now to date in my urban design portfolio is the ones where I'm rolling up my sleeves and I'm there with the community and we're drawing on boards and, you know, we're playing with stickers and we're co-designing, right? It's messy. It's tearing up paper, it's building blocks, it's all of the things that's not the perfect straight line on our presentation boards, right? And so I think I would shift your question, Victor, also to a lot of the discussions that AIA and AIS has been having lately about the civic architect, right? I think right now in schools, we're still so tunnel focused on the education being so secular and focused on design of a specific space rather than us thinking critically about the everyday problems that we're facing and really kind of challenging ourselves to think outside of our design box, right? And to really apply our analytical thinking skills to our everyday problems. Because the one thing I will give our education kudos to is us being able to solve problems. That is something that we all leave and graduate adept at. And I think we should use that to our advantage and try to solve real world problems.
Yeah, wow. I'll just keep adding on, and because that question was, there's a lot to it, and there's so many layers of to unpack. I love and accept and acknowledge the idea that like some of the answers to the problems we're trying to see don't exist, which means the only way to try and find them is to experiment. And even the idea that says, hey, we have to I think challenge the belief that there are limitations in some areas of architecture. And it's not to say that they don't exist, but it's just, you know, some of them are just assumed that like architecture can't solve housing challenges or, you know, issues around gentrification, but it's like, but have we tried? The one that's been on my mind, and it's still, and I think it is going to be your generation's charge, and maybe my generation's charge is to help you get there or to put you in position to solve some of these challenges. But it's 2 years ago, it's no accident. Melvin Mitchell released his book, African American Architects of Black History Month 2020. And he gets to his concluding thoughts and he starts to get to, you know, how I've been feeling about some of these challenges the last couple of years, which is that basically we're in a time when the silo that we believe architecture and design has to come down, and that we need more people involved and we need more people engaged in the conversation. And the idea that an architect only does this one thing has to change. And I think we have to, I don't know how to get there, but we have to become more. His idea was, and the thing that haunts me is his challenge that says, hey, there's been 400 years of challenges in and around Black and brown communities or overlooked communities. And I think the biggest disappointment is knowing that there's going to be this huge wave of investment that's needed, because we need to build in cities, and more often than not, the demographics of those cities are in those, you know, red, yellow, and blue areas on those red line maps. It's going to take a different thought process. And he was saying the biggest disappointment would be to look back in 20, 30 years about all the investment that happened in these neighborhoods and to say, oh, it's the same people who have always benefited historically from that investment. So I think I've seen and known of some really creative people that are kind of in another generation, because it involves creative ways of funding projects or unique ways of kind of getting people involved, or just like you said, groups like Design as Protest or other groups that are coming up with unique ways to solve challenges, but instead of it being the idea that there's, you know, a developer who has all the dollars that comes in and does something, hey, it's a group of people who had this idea and they bought some land and they figured out a way to raise dollars. And then the group who benefited from that investment is the people who live in the neighborhood now. I don't know how to get there, but I do think considering pushing and being willing to lose or to fail is really the, like, we got to try, right? We got to start somewhere. But I do think, I don't know, for me, it's been yes, there is this history, but it's got to be the awareness of the history, and we got to look forward to that 20 years from now.
Thank you all so much. So we're going to move into our final question now. So if everybody, or if anybody has questions, if you could please put them in the chat, or you can unmute after we answer this final question, that would be awesome. Okay, so our final question is, what advice would you give to young Black people and people of color who are entering architecture and trying to navigate the field?
I don't know. I'll try. There's so many places to start. You're entering and trying to navigate the field. I think my advice is to take full advantage, to push and challenge, because I do think we're in a time where people are willing to listen and hear your challenge that you're putting forward. And I do believe, different than generations past, you will have a seat at the table. You will have a seat at many tables that many people have never sat at before, like you. And I think for me, one of the things that I found so much harder than I expected is to find your personal voice and to be brave enough to say, to express that in a room where you're saying, hey, I got this unique opportunity that I never thought I would have. And the worst thing is to try and get there and try to be who you think they want you to be, rather than to be yourself. And I think when you're coming into the field, there's this fear of trying to fit the mold that's been created. And I think now more than ever, we need people to challenge the mold and say, hey, I am myself. I am this unique individual. I bring this great background. And then when you get out and start working, to be that, to just say, hey, own it and live it and be it. And when someone says, hey, what's your opinion, to be brave and vocal and open about it, and to put all of who you are into your work. But it's hard. So.
Yeah, I think I love that advice, Jonathan. I definitely took a lot of time after graduating my PWI to like just deconstruct all of the negative kind of thoughts and belittleness that was instilled in me from that education. And so when I think about what advice I would give, I always reflect on when I was homeless in college because going home really there wasn't a home to go back to, right? And I had just studied abroad, which was an all-time educational high for me, living in Greece on an island, but coming back to being maxed out on every financial avenue that was available to me, and not having parents that could get student loans or loans, period, because they didn't qualify because of all the policies and racism that we talked about earlier, right? But it ultimately led to me being homeless for an entire semester. And it was like the darkest time in my life. And I reflect on what I would tell her. And it really boils down to, you know, if I didn't feel heard, keep speaking, right? If you feel like your voice is not heard, if you feel like you're preaching to the choir or no one around you understands, keep speaking. If you feel lonely, you're not alone. There's a lot of lonely nights. If you feel lonely, you're not alone. And if one door closes, 3 will open. So I think just kind of taking a leap of faith in this industry is something that a lot of Blacks just have to do, because a lot of the paths that we're charting are new. No one has done it before us. I cannot tell you how many Black women around me are the first to do something, right? And it's it is going to continue to happen, at least throughout my lifetime and through most of yours. But we want to get to that point where we're beyond that as an industry, right? And so the last thing I would say in closing is, my kind of mantra and my way of living has been, if there is no well to drink from, to dig until I create one. Because a lot of spaces that I've stepped into have been brand new, and you kind of just have to own it, and make it your own space.
And I would just echo what my colleagues are saying here. You have to find an ally and allies. For me, it was my program director. Thankfully, it was someone in leadership who was willing to hear what I had to say. And it got to the point where I would say, there should be a Black student group, and we should have, a dinner for Black History Month, and we should have a dinner in a space where we can not talk about architecture, but just talk about being Black. And she co-signed that. And then we started doing that every Black History Month. Having someone just who gets it, and that may be someone in architecture, that may be a teacher you may find, that may be someone in a completely different university, but also is going through the same things that you're going through. But find that person and let that person know how you're feeling and how you're doing. Also, I would say take advantage of free therapy in your colleges if they have it. There is a stigma on mental health in Black and Brown communities. And let me tell you something, I'm still trying to undo 6 years worth of depression and anxiety. It is difficult, and there's no reason to, not, reach out to someone. Even if you can't, make it official, just use whatever free services are there at your college. Reach out to someone. And also networking. I'm gonna do a plug for First 500. Network, reach out to people on social media. When it comes to Black and Brown people who are the first to do something or had to struggle and fight for their way to, be successful, they are more than willing to help you get up to. We love seeing, Black excellence here. So anytime someone reaches out, I'm always like, yes, let's do this. I know this person, I know that person. I heard this university is good, so you should reach out to this professor. There's so many networks, you have no idea, who knows who. So definitely, reach out, find your people, and go to therapy. And also just all architecture students and also all architecture professors should be required to go to therapy, because we've had generations of studio abuse. But that's a whole another webinar for another day.
Thank you all for your responses. We will now open the floor to get a couple questions in from the audience. We do have less than 15 minutes, so we just want to be courteous of everybody's time on the call. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute or send in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all that you shared. I'm feeling very empowered right now, and I've loved listening to your stories. I'm just curious, based on Jacoby, where you just left off, how the three of you have been able to just keep going. Have you ever come across those points in your journey where maybe you're at a crossroads, and what has kept you motivated to continue on with the work that you're doing?
I guess I'll just speak first, also still as a student. I don't think there's been a quarter or a semester where I didn't have some type of mental breakdown. I think every person who goes through this, who is a first or maybe the only one in that year, feels like quitting. I don't know anyone who at one point didn't feel like quitting. But I didn't quit, right? I'm still here, and I know that what I'm doing matters. For me, what fuels me is that I'm also a teacher assistant at Penn, and hearing my students say that, you bringing up this certain article that talks about, racism and some of these figures we're learning about is important to me, and you're the only one that does that. Or having my students say, like, you're the only one that allows us to, vent and feel seen before getting into, schoolwork, and allow us to feel like a human. That propels me forward. To see Black women who came after me at Drexel get recognized by their local AIS universities as student of the weeks, that propels me forward. I'm like, yes, like I'm opening up doors for you, and like doors that like didn't even open for me are now opening for them. And being able to see that is just honestly such a blessing and empowering. And those are things that, I'm not doing it just for me. And that's what I have to remind myself about. This research that I'm doing is not, it's not for me. It's not something that like, I'm just doing it because I'm really interested in this. It's like, I'm doing it so that, 3 generations from now, there's not a Black girl asking why she doesn't see herself on the curriculum, right? And like, those are the things that keep propelling me forward. And I hate to say it, but I always come back to like, if it's not me, then who? And so like that, if I was to give up right now, there wouldn't be another Black woman in the PhD architecture program at Penn, right? Like, I don't like at that point, like giving up is not an option. I need to just keep going. And yeah, it gets rough. And there are times I feel like quitting. But I don't know. I guess this is just a secret that everyone at some point feels like quitting.
Yeah, I would say, is it Shane? I would say just find your purpose and what drives you. For me, passion has really what's kept me alive and what's kept me going in this industry. I think I was desperately searching for a space, a safe space, right? Other Black women, myself in our curriculum, right? And just really couldn't find that. And then getting into practice and still being lost and not being able to kind of find my safe space was ultimately how First 500 came about, but also was flipped. I flipped the coin and turned it into a passion, right? Like creating this space that Black women can all kind of have here in the industry, in a place where we're the most underrepresented, but still having this kind of community that we can come together in was a passion for me and what really drives me. And I would also say, you guys, you students, our young folks, our future minds have been such an inspiration to me, and it's definitely keeping me going and pushing me. And, I make myself as available as I can be to connect with students, whether it's to view your portfolios, give you tips and tricks on how to get in a firm like SOM or Moody Nolan, but making myself as accessible and available as possible to you. Because I didn't have that, as a student. I didn't even know like practicing professionals outside of the white men in Springfield, Missouri, right? So just changing that paradigm and making sure that we're hopefully laying out a groundwork to make it a little bit easier for you guys than it was for us.
Yeah, there's so much there. And it's like, I'm like, where to even start? I feel like he got it from somewhere else, but there's this Will Smith quote that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which he said, the goal, you don't set out to build a wall, right? You set out to lay one brick as perfectly as possible, right? And then, and then the next day you lay another brick as perfectly as possible. And then before you know it, it's a wall. And I remember, like, so everybody has those moments of like, oh my gosh, is this even possible? And for me, and I think you have to find your own personal network that can help be a sounding board of purpose and even inspiration. So for me, it was family and church. And I remember thinking about like, oh my gosh, my family did so much and I have to try and, make them proud. But it wasn't trying to solve, like, it wasn't like, oh my gosh, how am I going to tackle 5 years? It was like, if I was literally a Sunday to Sunday, and it's like, oh my gosh, I made it to another Sunday. And it was like, do I think I can get to another Sunday? Do I think I can make it to another Sunday service? And it was like, well, on Monday, I need to do this. On Tuesday, I need to do that. On Wednesday, and it was like day by day, week by week. And believe it or not, it's like, that is exactly how I've gotten through the last 2 years. It's like, before you know it, I mean, it's like, wait, we've been doing this day by day thing for 2 years now. And even recently, I'm like, sometimes it's little things. I bought this. This is a bottle of mustard seeds, right? Of like, these little bitty things, but this small belief that I can just get through one more day can make a world of difference. So I keep it in my bag now, believe it or not.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses. We'll just fit in one final question for the night. So whoever would like to ask, go ahead and ask away.
I had a question. Hi, my name is Akila. And my question was, when you guys were talking about studio culture and stuff, how do you guys find it that you can combat the perfectionism? Because personally, I feel like sometimes there isn't room to make mistakes and you kind of just have to keep pushing forward, but trying to make the best of what you can. So how do you kind of combat the perfectionism?
I can only answer, so maybe we go back in reverse order. I can only answer because my experience was unique, because I played football, and that changed a lot of perspectives, because instead of being like, oh, I've got all night to do whatever and I can just make it perfect over, it was like, no, I need to get at least 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I got back to studio 7, 8 o'clock at night. I got 6 a.m. workout. Like I got this many hours to get as much done as I can. And that was always my challenge each night, is not to say, oh, I'm just gonna work until it's done. It was like, no, I need to get as much done in this finite period of time. The fascinating thing, that is like the biggest life skill I rely on right now, because more than anything, like if you happen to work in a traditional firm, all of our fees are fixed numbers, right? And instead of being like, oh, we've got forever to make the most perfect building possible, it's like, well, hey, look, we got X number of dollars for each phase of the project. So it becomes like, working that way is exactly what the practice is. It's like, yeah, you can work and stress yourself out, or you can say, hey, what is the best I can do, and kind of train yourself in the mindset of how do I get done as much as possible within this time. And then frankly, whatever it is, it'll be good enough. I remember when I first started at Moody Nolan, there's this guy, Woojin, he's Korean, and he was just saying, we do the best we can in the time we have, and it's just got to be enough. It just is. So I think about that a lot.
Yeah, I agree. Time management is very important. As a person that worked a full-time job and went to architecture school the entire way, it was definitely key to have those time management skills. The other thing I would say, Akila, is you could totally challenge your professors by bringing in outside professionals that you feel like probably relate more to what scheme you're putting forward, or if you want a more sketchier kind of persona to your project, you could find supporting material out there that shows where that is successful. I'm thinking of Walter Hood's renderings and work. If you look at it, it's very it's not perfect lines. It's very kind of sketchy and loose, and it's very beautiful, the way it is. You could find those case studies, right? And bring those to the forefront and say, here's an example of a world-class, amazing, award-winning architecture firm that does this and does it well. The other thing is, if you guys are having challenges with perspectives on your work, like if you're choosing to do it as an imperfectionist way of showing your skills, then yes, bring in outside folks that have that experience that could then help you defend your projects to your professors. Because a lot of those folks are actually in practice, right? It's not so much tied to the academic way and this having to be the right way, but showing your professors a new way.
I think when it comes to probably like personal mentality of perfectionism, I think what works well is prioritizing your own mental health and physical health and spiritual health, and using that also as a tool for architectural resistance. I mean, there's many times where professors are like, well, you need to do like 5 more renderings. B2 dubs, they were due 3 hours ago, so like get on it. And sometimes it's okay to say, no, instead of doing these extra renderings, I'm going to go to bed, because sleeping and being alert for tomorrow is more important to me than this project that you're not even going to look at these renderings, right? Or they're still not going to be good enough for you. Therefore, I'm going to prioritize myself and use that as a tool of resistance. I mean, there's a really big terrible studio culture in general for architecture across the country, across the world, and there's this no sleep till crit mentality that you need to sacrifice as much as you can to get, you know, enough things to pin up on the board. And to be honest, 5 years from now, when you look back on your portfolio, you're probably going to think it's garbage anyway. So it's like, do you really need to sacrifice your sleep for that? No, you don't. And like, as a person who just graduated in 2020, who's still trying to catch up on sleep, it's a myth. You can't catch up on sleep. Okay. It can't be done scientifically. And it's just not, it's not worth it. One thing that I did similar to Jonathan, I actually got involved in gospel choir, and I knew every Thursday from like 7 to 9, I needed to be in gospel choir, and it was a course. So I was like, I can't fail gospel choir because that just looks stupid. So I need to make sure I'm there, and I need to make sure I'm practicing. Therefore, I know I can't be in studio all night on Thursdays. So I need to work my butt off Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, because Thursday's my day off and Friday I'm tired. So I'm going home. And that's just the way it was for a few years. And I got to the point where, you know, sometimes you do your crappy sketch and you stay up all night trying to do this perfect drawing, and the only drawing your professor cares about is the sketchy stuff that you spent 5 minutes on. So in reality, you know, this whole perfectionism it's all in our head. And I know that sometimes we try to meet the demand of our professors because we think they're your clients. You pay the university doesn't pay you. Okay, so just sleep. Just sleep. You sleep as your protest. And that's my thing.
Yeah, I gotta add on, because oh my gosh, I didn't realize that until grad school, that you're paying them to educate you. It's yes, and that is an empowering realization. You're paying them to educate you. Get out of it what you want out of it.
All right, we are right at 6:30. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences, advice, and just all the other work that you are all a part of. We can't thank you enough for joining us tonight. So snaps for our guest speakers, everybody. Again, thank you on behalf of the AIS. So we will all see you all later in our next webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Great job, everyone. Shannon here. Do you want me to stop the recording for you all?
Yes, we could go ahead and stop it.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Shannon.